The first Interex arrow did not whistle, did not sing, did not even disturb the air. It appeared. One moment the breeze over Xenobia's marble causeways carried only the warmth of evening sun. The next, a shard of light pierced the throat of an Imperial envoy and pinned him to the ground like an insect specimen, his blood painting the stone in a quiet red bloom. The Imperium had known sudden violence before, but never a silence like this. Never an enemy who killed without sound, hesitation, or anger. It was the silence that broke the world long before the first order to fire was given. Across the plaza, the Interex war chorus advanced with inhuman discipline, each step a perfect echo of the last, their armor shimmering with circuitry that pulsed like veins beneath a living symphony. They moved not as warriors but as an orchestra, every motion harmonized with the next, every breath a note in a composition designed for killing without waste. Their weapons glowed with restrained brilliance, some shaped like bows of crystallized starlight, others like curved-bladed instruments carved from shimmering alloys that caught the sun and bent it into a spectrum of threat. They were beautiful and terrifying, and the Imperium did not understand them. That was why they lost. Leman Russ had not intended diplomacy. He stood among his wolves like a thunderhead waiting for the first crack. His eyes followed the Interex with the quiet fury of a predator who had smelled deceit long before it manifested. He had warned the War Master that the Interex were hiding something, that the harmony they preached was nothing more than a veil stitched over fear. Russ knew fear. He wore it like a cloak. It whispered to him through the instincts that the Allfather had sharpened into something close to prophecy. Yet even he failed to foresee the precision of the first strike. When the second envoy fell, killed by a luminous bolt that seemed to bloom from nowhere, Russ drew Frostfang in a single fluid motion. The blade devoured the last strands of peace that still lingered on the plaza. His wolves responded without command, bolters raised, formation tightening like a closing jaw. They did not fire, not yet. Even the Vlika were stunned by the Interex. These were not panicked hosts defending themselves. They were executing a premeditated culling, a decision reached through quiet consensus long before the Imperium had stepped foot on Xenobia's soil. Above the plaza, Interex skyriders descended in spiraling arcs, their wings of metallic feathers glinting in the sun as they painted lethal geometry into the sky. They moved with impossible grace, bodies twisting in ways that defied human articulation, guided by an ancient discipline that fused body and machine into a single purposeful entity. Their weapons did not fire projectiles. They released threads of coherent light that sliced through armor with surgical cruelty. A legionary near Russ staggered as a line of incandescent brilliance cut clean through his thigh, the armor sizzling as the limb fell to the stone. For a heartbeat, Russ saw the battle that would follow. He saw burning streets. He saw wolves and sons and human auxiliaries dying in alleys that had been meant for celebration. He saw a war born from misunderstanding that would spiral until both sides bled themselves dry. And he saw his own failure buried beneath the weight of two civilizations that could not speak the same truth. The future could have bent in another direction, but not after the third envoy fell. Diplomacy died in the dust. The War Master arrived moments too late to halt the collapse. Horus Lupercal stepped into the maelstrom with the confidence of a demigod who believed he could command any storm into obedience. But Xenobia was no storm. It was a revelation. The Interex saw him not as a negotiator, not as a brother in arms, but as the harbinger of a darkness that would one day consume the galaxy. Their intelligence networks had long mapped the trajectories of human ambition. Their scholars had predicted the arc of Imperial expansion with disturbing accuracy. They knew what Horus represented. They had seen what the Imperium did to every civilization that refused its creed. They believed they were witnessing the opening act of their own annihilation. The War Master's attempt at parley died beneath a chorus of Interex war songs that vibrated the plaza stones. Their battle psalms were not hymns to gods. They were encrypted orders, tactical harmonies woven into the cadence of sound itself, enabling instantaneous coordination across ranks. In an instant, the Interex formations shifted, lines folding into new patterns like a tessellated puzzle revealing fresh shapes. Their front ranks raised shields that shimmered with refracted light, bending the incoming bolter rounds fired by panicked auxilia into harmless spirals of molten metal that fell around them like meteor rain. Horus turned to Russ, his expression a silent question balanced between fury and confusion. Russ answered only by stepping forward, Frostfang raised, eyes locked on the Interex commander whose armor was etched with constellations that shifted with each heartbeat. It was a silent agreement between two suns forged in the crucible of conquest. Peace had failed. Understanding had been a mirage. War was the only language left. The Interex commander lowered his spear of curved starlight. The gesture was not hostile. It was ritualistic, a farewell to peace, a salute to an enemy they respected enough to kill cleanly. His helm retracted with a whisper of light, revealing eyes that held sorrow rather than hatred. He understood the inevitability of this moment, perhaps more than any Imperial present. Horus stepped forward, voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him. He tried once more, even now, to salvage something from the collapsing moment. The Interex commander shook his head with slow, deliberate certainty. It was not refusal, it was regret. He whispered a phrase in his own language, a string of harmonics impossible to translate, but the meaning struck the War Master with the weight of prophecy. Later, Horus would recall that sound as the first warning he had ever truly heard, delivered by an enemy who knew him better than he knew himself. The commander raised his spear. The Interex unleashed their full might. Xenobia ignited. The plaza became a crucible of clashing realities. Imperial bolters tore through shimmering shields that bent light itself. Interex blades of condensed resonance carved through ceramite as if sculpting marble. The air vibrated as invisible harmonics collided with the deep thunder of bolter fire, creating a cacophony that felt like a planet screaming through its own birth. Even the Primarchs staggered beneath the sensory assault. Russ fought like a creature born from war, his blade cutting arcs of frost through the golden haze. Horus moved, with calculated brilliance, every strike a lesson in leadership and lethal precision. But for the first time since the Great Crusade began, they were losing. The Interex fought with knowledge the Imperium did not possess. They understood the flaws in Astartes' armor, the gaps in Imperial doctrine, the points where human predictability faltered beneath pressure. They exploited everything with merciless harmony. Every Interex warrior fought as if guided by a singular intelligence, not psychic, not technological, something in between. A species whose collective discipline bridged the space between thought and action. The Imperium had met many enemies, but never a civilization so refined, so coordinated, and so unwilling to bend. Xenobia became the first world where Imperial expansion did not just falter, it shattered. And as the plaza burned, as Russ roared and Horus struggled to understand how history had slipped from his grasp, the Interex made their final decision. They would not defeat the Imperium. They would save the galaxy from it. The retreat from Xenobia should have been simple. It should have been orderly, disciplined, a controlled extraction of Imperial forces from a battlefield turned hostile. Instead, it became a slow collapse, a retreat carried out beneath the gaze of an enemy who refused to strike the killing blow. The Imperium was accustomed to enemies who pursued without mercy. The Interex did not. They withdrew from pursuit as if the Imperials were not a threat to be eliminated but a wound that they feared cutting deeper. It was not mercy. It was containment. Horus felt the shape of that containment long before he understood it. Even as he evacuated his wounded, even as he barked orders that kept the collapsing front line from disintegrating into panic, a sensation pressed against his mind like a hand against a locked door. He did not hear the pressure. He felt it. A vigilance that was not psychic, not sorcerous, but strategic. Every Interex movement on the battlefield had been measured, calculated, positioned to guide the Imperials away from key structures. They never struck at the landing zones, never targeted the ships that would ferry the wounded away. They did not want the Imperium destroyed here. They wanted the Imperium to leave. The Mournival gathered around Horus in the aftermath, each bearing marks of a battle that should never have been fought. Tarik Torgadon's armor was scorched and pitted as if a sunbeam had turned violent against him. Garviel Loken's left pauldron was sliced clean through by a weapon that left no scorch marks, only a perfect seam in the ceramite, as if it had been unmade rather than cut. Abaddon alone looked unshaken, but his eyes betrayed the truth. The first captain had seen something that rattled him, something he did not want to articulate. Horus noticed. He always noticed. Before he could speak to them, Xenobia answered for him. The Interex did not wait for Imperial withdrawal. They surrounded the Imperial landing zones with formations arranged in concentric rings, each rank aligned with a precision that would have stunned even the most disciplined solar auxilia cohorts. Their banners shimmered with kinetic light, casting shifting patterns across their armor. The air around them hummed with a resonance that felt like a heartbeat imposed on the world itself. It was not a threat. It was a decree. You may leave, but you will not return. Horus stepped forward, Frostclaw dripping with melted gold from Interex weaponry. He called out for parley, his voice carrying the full weight of a Primarch, a force of will that could bend lesser men into obedience. His words rolled across the battlefield with authority born of conquest and the conviction that he alone could salvage meaning from this disaster. The Interex commander approached with the slow, deliberate dignity of a judge delivering a sentence. His armor refracted the dying light of the sun into shifting galaxies. His spear hummed with restrained power that suggested it preferred motion to stillness. His face was human, almost painfully so. There was no hatred in his eyes, only resolve. He spoke in a language that carried tones layered like chords. The translator servitors labored to interpret, their machine voices flattening the harmonics into Imperial Gothic stripped of their nuance. War Master Horus, your arrival was a wound we prepared for. Your empire brings fire where it seeks peace. We saw what your Imperium will become. We saw the shadow following you. You cannot be allowed to touch our worlds again. Horus demanded an explanation, but the commander did not respond to demands. He responded to consequence. You carry a darkness that does not yet know its own name. The War Master's jaw tightened. Russ would have taken the insult as a challenge, a provocation that demanded blood. Horus heard something else within it. A prophecy, a warning, a truth, wrapped in sorrow. The commander stepped aside, giving the Imperials a corridor through which to escape. The gesture was unmistakable. The war was over. Xenobia belonged to the Interex. The Imperium would depart in disgrace. Yet as the wolves carried their dead to the landing craft and the Mournival supported their wounded brothers, they saw something strange. Interex scholars and war sages moved through the battlefield, tending to Imperial wounded who had been abandoned or overlooked. They lifted Astartes as if they were sacred burdens and treated human auxiliaries with tenderness that felt unreal in the aftermath of battle. They did not save them out of mercy. They saved them because knowledge mattered to them. Every life carried information. Every wound carried meaning. They wanted to understand the Imperium every bit as much as they wanted to keep it at bay. Horus watched as an Interex medic placed a glowing palm over the chest of a dying legionary. The light sank through the armor as if it were water, stabilizing the warrior long enough for Imperial Medicae to take over. The War Master stepped toward the medic, confusion and suspicion warring in his expression. The Interex healer looked up, eyes filled not with fear but patient sadness. We do not desire your extinction. We desire your containment. You carry the seed of chaos in your shadow. We will not let it spread. Those words carved themselves into Horus like a blade. He wanted to demand clarity, to insist that the Imperium brought unity, not destruction. But the words caught in his throat. Something in the healer's eyes made him hesitate. Something ancient. Something informed by centuries of knowledge the Imperium had never possessed. Russ approached, gauntleted hands slick with blood, his beard matted with ash. His eyes searched the battlefield with the intensity of a hunter denied his prey. This is no victory, brother. They let us go. Horus answered quietly. No, they spared the galaxy from what they think we will become. He did not know why those words chilled him more than the battlefield itself. The extraction took hours. The fleet above Xenobia struggled to coordinate under the strain of casualties, damaged systems, and the shock of defeat. Imperial ships lifted from the surface under the watchful presence of Interex skyriders who hovered like silent judgment. They tracked each ship's trajectory, ensuring none dared veer toward critical Interex infrastructure. The message was unmistakable. You have been measured. You have been found wanting. When the last gunship rose from Xenobia's soil, the Interex war chorus raised their weapons in unison. The gesture was not a salute. It was a warning, a line drawn across history. As the fleet entered high orbit, Horus stood at the viewing bay of the vengeful spirit, watching the planet recede beneath a haze of twilight. He felt something unravel behind his ribs. It was not fear. He had faced horrors far more terrible. It was the recognition of a possibility he had never considered. The Imperium had encountered a civilization more advanced, more stable, more morally anchored than anything in its 10,000-year path of conquest. A civilization that did not fear the Imperium's armies. A civilization that viewed humanity's empire not as a threat to itself, but as a threat to the galaxy. The Interex had seen something coming, something the Imperium was too blind to perceive. Horus turned away from the viewing bay and felt the first quiet fracture run through the certainty that had guided him since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. It was small, it was subtle, it was lethal. In the silence of the strategium, Russ approached with the heavy tread of a warrior who knew the battle was not truly over. "We go home in shame," he said. Horus shook his head. "No. We go home carrying a warning the Imperium will refuse to hear." Russ frowned. "What warning?" Horus looked. Back at Xenobia, now a shrinking orb of light behind the fleet. "That we are not the future, we are the threat." The words hung between them like a prophecy waiting to unfold. And far below, on Xenobia's surface, the Interex war sages gathered around a device sealed in a vault older than the Imperium itself. They spoke in tones meant to conceal dread rather than inspire it. Because the arrival of the Imperium had confirmed their greatest fear, the future had already begun to unravel, and the War Master was its fulcrum. The fleet's return to compliance space should have brought clarity. Instead, it delivered confusion wrapped in unease. Reports from across the War Master's expedition painted a contradictory picture. Worlds recently pacified now questioned Imperial presence. Local cultures that had once bent the knee without protest now cited the Interex as proof that coexistence was possible. The Imperium's message of unity was being weighed against a civilization that had met the Imperium's spear point and held it in place without breaking. Every transmission that trickled into the vengeful spirit whispered the same quiet heresy. Perhaps the Imperium was not inevitable. Horus stood in the strategium for hours, surrounded by data projections, casualty manifests, and battlefield recordings. He played the footage of the Xenobia clash again and again, not as a soldier studying his defeat, but as a scholar dissecting a contradiction. The Interex had not fought like conquerors. They had not fought like prey. They had fought like custodians of a truth too terrible to let outsiders touch. They had tried to guide the Imperials away without escalating the conflict. It struck him as strange that such a tactic had succeeded. He was War Master. He had led compliance after compliance without pause or hesitation. And yet, on Xenobia, he had been outmaneuvered without even realizing a maneuver had taken place. Russ entered without ceremony. He moved with restless energy of a warrior forced into reflection, a state that ill suited him. His presence broke the silence like a stone cast into still water. "You have not slept," Russ said. "Neither have you," Horus replied. Russ growled a wordless acknowledgement. He studied the holograms with narrowed eyes, his instincts passing patterns that others overlooked. The Wolf Primarch did not trust scholars or augurs, but he trusted his own senses, and they whispered danger. "You keep watching that moment when they stepped back," Russ said. "Why that moment?" Horus paused the projection on the Interex commander's retreat, capturing the instant where the warrior lowered his spear and yielded the field. The War Master examined the image with a quiet intensity. "Because he did not retreat," Horus said. He allowed us to leave. He understood something we did not. He knew that war with us would not destroy them. It would destroy us. Russ folded his arms. A threat is a threat. They were preparing for conflict long before we arrived. No, Horus said softly. They were preparing for prophecy. That word hung heavy. Primarchs were not accustomed to speaking in the language of prophecy. It belonged to sorcerers and mystics, not sons of the Emperor. And yet Horus said it without hesitation, as if the truth lived behind his teeth, and demanded release. Russ leaned closer, studying the frozen warrior. You think they saw something in us. I think they saw something in me. The tension between them deepened. Russ had never trusted prophecy, but he trusted Horus enough to tolerate the idea. He waited for the War Master to continue, and when Horus did, his voice carried a rare uncertainty. They looked at me, not with hatred, but with expectation, as if they had been waiting for me to arrive, as if they had been warned. Russ frowned. Warned by whom? Horus did not answer, because he did not know. The uncertainty coiled in his mind like a dormant serpent. He hated uncertainty. He hated the feeling that the galaxy had moved 2 steps ahead while he remained anchored in ignorance. But ignorance had been his companion since Xenobia. It shadowed him now. The hololithic displays shifted abruptly as a new transmission arrived. The Vox officer saluted sharply. War Master, priority encoded message from the far fringe of the Interex borders. It originates from a rogue trader vessel fleeing Interex space. They report a discovery of significant nature. Horus signaled for the transmission. The image that flickered into existence was grainy, distorted, and half-drowned in static. It showed a man with eyes wide from fear, his skin pallid under the strobing lights of a failing Vox system. This is Captain Vylor of the merchantman Crimson Lass. We attempted to breach Interex borders for trade opportunities. They found us. They do not hunt like humans. They do not communicate like humans. They warned us to turn back. We refused. Russ snorted. Of course they refused. The transmission continued, growing more desperate. They boarded us without firing a shot. They disabled the weapons by touching them. They moved like light given purpose. But that is not the worst of it. They knew who we were. They knew we had spoken to the Imperials. They knew we carried data about Xenobia. They said something I do not understand. The captain swallowed hard, sweat mixing with static. They said the Imperium walks with the shadow of the Primarch who will shatter the galaxy. They said the one who carries the future of humanity's doom has already stepped onto their soil. They said the War Master has been marked since birth. Horus felt the breath leave his chest. The transmission ended with a burst of feedback. Russ stared at him. The expression on the Wolf Primarch's face held no mockery, no challenge, only fear. Not fear of the Interex, fear of the implication. Horus dismissed the crew with emotion. When they were alone, Russ took a step forward. You know this is madness, Russ said. You know it means nothing. It means something to them, Horus replied. They believed it enough to fight us. They believed it enough to spare us. They spared us because they did not want a war on 2 fronts, Russ argued. Their enemies are older than us. Their wisdom is older. They fear knowledge more than they fear our armies. Horus turned away, his reflection fragmented across the hololithic displays. They fear what I will become. Russ barked a harsh laugh. You? Turn on the Imperium. You, who have never let doctrine falter. Horus did not answer immediately. That is what troubles me, he said at last. I have never doubted my purpose, never questioned the Emperor's design. But the moment I stepped onto Xenobia, I felt as if the ground itself knew a truth I could not see. Russ's face hardened. If you start chasing ghosts, you will drag the Legion into madness. Horus looked at him with a quiet sorrow. What if I am the ghost? The words struck Russ like a blow. The Wolf Primarch opened his mouth to rebuke the thought, to laugh it away, but the memory of the Interex commander's eyes stopped him cold. There had been recognition there. Recognition and regret. Before Russ could respond, the strategium lights shifted again. another transmission. This one came from an unexpected source. Intercepted Interex signals, encrypted but partially decoded by Mechanicum adepts aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The decoded fragment played. A calm, harmonic voice spoke 9 words. Contain the War Master. Do not let him ascend. Russ's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Horus whispered the words aloud, as if tasting poison. Not him, not anyone else. Me. The lights dimmed around them, and the silence pressed in. The seed of doubt planted on. Xenobia took root. And in that moment, the fate of the Imperium shifted 1 degree closer to ruin. The Vengeful Spirit drifted through the void like a wounded beast, lights dimmed to conserve power after the frantic escape from Interex space. Yet the ship's wounds were not physical. They were ideological, psychological. The crew moved through the corridors with quiet dread, whispering about the battle on Xenobia, the strange weapons, the uncanny silence of an enemy who did not hate them. Rumors spread like infection. Some swore the War Master hesitated during the battle. Others claimed the Interex had known his name long before they met him. A few whispered that the Imperium had finally encountered a civilization the Emperor feared. Horus ignored the rumors, but he could not silence their echo inside himself. The Mournival assembled in the War Council chamber, summoned without explanation. The chamber felt smaller than usual, its vaulted architecture pressing down on them as if the ship itself listened for answers that no one could provide. Loken stood rigid, jaw tight, waiting for Horus to explain the intercepted message. Torgadon leaned against a support pillar, arms folded across his chest, trying to appear dismissive but failing. Abaddon stood closest to Horus, the posture of a bodyguard rather than a brother. Horus remained silent for several breaths. Then he replayed the intercepted Interex transmission. Contain the War Master. Do not let him ascend. The recording ended in the same cold silence it had arrived in. Torgadon exhaled sharply. So that is it. They are afraid of us. Afraid of you. Afraid of what the Imperium represents. Nothing new. They are not afraid of the Imperium, Loken said quietly. They are afraid of him. Abaddon turned sharply. Watch your tongue. Loken held his gaze. You heard their words. They did not speak of humanity or armies or crusades. They spoke of Horus. The room tensed. Horus raised a crescent hand before Abaddon could respond. Loken is not wrong. The Interex knew me. They prepared for me. They believed my arrival was the catalyst for something catastrophic. Torgadon shook his head. Prophecy. Superstition. Their ancestors probably read the future in star charts and declared destiny a math equation. Horus studied Torgadon with a look that carried more sorrow than frustration. They are not primitives reading smoke. Their civilization predates our arrival into the galaxy's center. Their knowledge of warp harmonics surpasses the Mechanicum's greatest minds. They have studied us longer than we have studied them, and they believed I carried a darkness that would reshape the future. Abaddon stepped forward. Then we crush them. If they spread this lie across their domains, we end the threat before it grows. Horus met Abaddon's eyes. And if it is not a lie? Silence wrapped the chamber like a shroud. Abaddon's jaw tightened. You doubt. Yourself. I question everything, Horus said. And a leader who questions nothing is doomed to lead blindly into ruin. Loken stepped closer, voice steady. What do you believe, my lord? The War Master closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked older, as if Xenobia had carved years from him. Since the Great Crusade began, he said, I believed our destiny was guided by the Emperor's vision. I believed we were instruments of unity, weapons forged for peace through victory. But on Xenobia, I felt something I have never felt. I felt the future pulling away from us. Russ had said something similar. The thought unsettled Horus more than any prophecy. Abaddon dismissed it with a bitter scoff. The only destiny is the one we carve from the bones of those who defy us. The Emperor entrusted you with command because you are the best of us. No civilization, no prophecy, no archive of forgotten lore changes that. Tolstoy might have been proud of the way Abaddon believed in singular human will. But the galaxy was not shaped by will alone. It was shaped by pressure, by context, by invisible patterns that guided even the strongest into traps laid centuries before they were born. Horus felt those patterns closing. Before he could speak, the chamber lights flickered. A Vox officer entered, saluted, and handed Horus a data slate. "Message from the Mechanicum attaché, my lord. They detected something unusual during the battle." Horus activated the slate. A hologram appeared, displaying a fractured energy signature. It twisted like a spiral of light bending inward, a pattern that seemed to recoil from observation. Mechanicum runes scrolled beneath it, simulating calculations with silent panic. "What is this?" Torgadon asked. The Vox officer swallowed. "They believe it is a sonic resonance pattern generated during the Interex battle hymns. It harmonized with the local warp presence." Abaddon frowned. "Explain in Gothic." The officer hesitated. They think the Interex used sound to push the warp back. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to shield their minds from its influence." The revelation struck the chamber like a thunderbolt. Loken spoke first. "They can deny chaos." Horus felt the hairs on his neck rise. "Not deny, resist." Torgadon shook his head slowly. "That explains the silence in their weapons, the harmony in their formations. Their culture is built around controlling the warp through discipline." Abaddon growled. "And that discipline makes them arrogant." "No," Horus said. "It makes them right." He zoomed the hologram. The resonance pattern pulsed like a heart. "The Interex were not just fighting us," Horus said. "They were protecting themselves from us. They saw the warp inside us. They saw the flaw carried in every human soul. They saw the potential for corruption." Loken whispered the forbidden thought. "They saw the future of the Imperium." And Horus felt the answer settle like cold iron. They saw what we would become if we continued on this path, if we continued expanding, if we continued shaping the galaxy in the Emperor's image. Abaddon slammed a gauntleted fist against the table. "Enough. You are the War Master. You are humanity's future. The Interex fear you because they know you will unite the galaxy under our banner." Horus shook his head. "No, they fear me because they believe I will destroy it." A cold dread pooled inside him. The Interex had encountered countless civilizations. They had archived histories stretching back to the Age of Strife and beyond. They had studied warp corruption with nuance the Imperium could not tolerate. They had seen patterns in the warp's currents that Imperial scholars dismissed as superstition. They had predicted threats long before they manifested. And they had looked at Horus and seen something worse than chaos. Loken stepped forward, voice steady. "We can still seek understanding. The Emperor taught us that knowledge is the foundation of unity." Abaddon shot him a glare of venom. "The Emperor taught us obedience." Horus raised a hand. The chamber fell silent. "We will not act until we understand the full scope of this truth, and we will not send this data to Terra yet, not until we know what we carry." He turned off the hologram. For the first time in his life, Horus Lupercal felt small, not lesser, but positioned within something vast and unseen. He dismissed the Mournival. As he watched them leave the chamber, each carrying their own doubts, he understood something chilling. The Interex had not feared the Imperium. They had feared who Horus might become. And deep in the ship's machine spine, beyond the reach of mortal senses, something in the warp shifted, not violently, not obviously, but with the subtlety of a shadow lengthening in a room with no light. The future was bending, and the War Master stood at its center. The vengeful spirit descended toward Davon's outer orbit as steady as a blade lowered toward a throat. The crew felt the tension in the ship's bones long before the landing order was given. Rumors had already reached them from scout vessels and covert operatives. The Interex were moving, not militarily, not aggressively, but with purpose. Their fleets had shifted along borders that had once been dormant. They established new listening posts on worlds the Imperium had not even catalogued. They built walls of silence across regions that had been open lanes for explorers. They were preparing for something. Horus stood at the command balcony, watching subtle movements across his tactical display. Each Interex maneuver was almost polite, yet each was a repositioning of power. They were not preparing for war. They were preparing for containment. The term had become a quiet obsession. He turned when Russ approached, shaking frost from his pauldrons like a wolf returning from a hunt. The Wolf King had taken the initiative to prowl the lower decks, listening to crew murmurs the way a beast listens to forest wind. Russ preferred raw truth to filtered reports. "They whisper your name," Russ said. "Not in loyalty, in fear." Horus looked back toward the display. "They should fear what I may become." "You sound like a seer," Russ replied. "You are no seer. You are the War Master. Your certainty is the fire that keeps men alive." Horus met Russ's stare with a deadened calm. "And what happens when certainty becomes a weapon aimed at the wrong horizon?" Russ's face tightened. "You believe the Interex. You believe their prophecy, their warnings, their fear." "I believe they saw something we did not," Horus said. "Something the Emperor did not tell us." Russ scoffed, but there was no mockery in it, only wounded pride. "You think the Emperor hides knowledge?" Horus turned from the display. "I know he does." That was the truth they had never spoken aloud. Every Primarch had encountered it. Each had been shaped, broken, reforged in the Emperor's image, but none had been given the full design. They were weapons built with incomplete schematics. Horus had always trusted his father regardless. Now he questioned whether that trust had been earned or simply engineered. Before Russ could respond, the door hissed open. Erebus of the Word-Bearers entered. Horus felt a ripple of irritation. The chaplain moved with confidence he had not earned on this ship, his dark robe marked with symbols meant to appear holy but reeking of something deeper. Erebus bowed deeply. "My War Master." "May I speak?" Russ growled. "Leave." Erebus smiled faintly. "I will not take long. I bring information." Horus gestured for silence. Against his better judgment, he permitted Erebus to speak. The chaplain drew a small crystalline device from his sleeve. It pulsed with a soft organic light. "We recovered this from Xenobia," Erebus said. "A fragment of their knowledge storage. It survived your encounter." Horus frowned. "You went back." "Not physically," Erebus said smoothly. "A relic hunter in my legion sent it before the Interex sealed the system. I analyzed it aboard the Ultramarine's vessel. It contains data we do not possess. Perhaps data the Emperor has withheld." Russ stepped closer. "You will hand that device to the Mechanicum." "Now." Erebus tilted his head in apology. "I already did. They could not access it." Horus took the device. It felt warm, alive. It hummed against his skin like a heartbeat. The Interex used knowledge the way the Imperium used weapons. Every piece of information carried context, resonance, meaning beyond the data itself. Horus whispered a command phrase in Binharic. The device responded. The chamber dimmed. The air grew heavy. The crystalline shard projected a cascade of symbols, constellations, shifting algebraic structures that flowed like luminous rivers. It was not a language. It was an insight. 3 images stabilized. The first was humanity during the Age of Strife, billions screaming under warp storms that tore sanity from bone, civilizations collapsing into dust. The second was the Imperium, armies marching, ships burning, planets falling into line under banners of order, a family portrait painted in fire. The third was something else, a shadow, not a figure, not an entity, a shape of possibility. Dark, ascendant, growing from the edges of vision. It expanded as if feeding on the light of the previous 2 images. Shapes inside it shifted like a beast stirring in sleep. Erebus spoke softly, almost reverently. "According to Interex archives, humanity carries a resonance pattern unlike any other species. Chaotic, unstable, violent. They claim humanity is a spark waiting for oxygen." Russ snorted. "Propaganda." "Perhaps," Erebus said, "but they believe the spark has a vessel." The projection shifted. The shadow took shape. It resembled a man. A tall figure with the potential to eclipse entire star systems in darkness. Not a god, not a demon. Something in between. something that history itself would bend around. Horus felt the air leave his lungs. Russ stepped back as if struck. "They think that is you." Erebus bowed. "They believe the War Master will one day stand at the threshold of godhood, or damnation, or both." The projection dissolved. Horus stared at the empty air. He felt nothing, not fear, not denial, only recognition. He dismissed Erebus and Russ with a motion that carried the weight of finality. When the chamber emptied, he stood alone in the trembling silence. His mind traced the shape of what he had seen. He remembered the Interex commander lowering his spear. He remembered the phrase in harmonic tones. "Contain the pair, War Master. Do not let him ascend," he whispered to himself. Ascend into what? There was no answer. Only the steady hum of the ship. But far beyond the walls of the vengeful spirit, hidden from Imperial sight, the Interex gathered again in their crystalline halls. War sages and sentinels of knowledge stood before the same projection Horus had seen, but their version was clearer, older, drawn from archives that predated the fall of Old Night. They spoke softly, voices harmonizing with quiet sorrow. The Primarch carries the flaw that will ignite the galaxy. He carries the wound of humanity's nature. He carries the path to a future he does not yet desire, but will one day embrace. "Contain him," a sage whispered, "while containment is still possible." And in the deep currents of the warp, something twisted, not in rage, in anticipation. The vengeful spirit prepared for transition to Davin, but the War Master's thoughts did not follow his ship. They drifted toward the shadow inside the Interex archive, toward the shape that resembled a man only in the way a storm resembles a cloud. Horus had been shaped for leadership, sculpted into a symbol of Imperial destiny, yet for the first time in his life, he felt the cold, unmistakable sensation of being observed by a future he had not chosen. The strategium lights dimmed as warp calculations began. The Geller fields pulsed in readiness. Crew chanted the sacred liturgies that kept sanity intact. Horus stood at the viewing port and watched the currents of unreality ripple against the ship's shields, their colors twisting like bruises beneath skin. There was beauty in the warp's violence, a beauty he had never acknowledged until Xenobia had planted a doubt that refused to die. A soft chime announced Russ's arrival. The Wolf King stepped beside him, gaze fixed on the tremors of the Imperium. Russ was never comfortable before a jump. His instincts protested at the idea of trusting one's fate to a realm where logic surrendered. Today his discomfort was sharper, more primal. "I received word from Terra," Russ said. "A message addressed to you, direct from the Emperor." Horus turned. The air shifted between them. Such messages were rare. The Emperor's silence had grown longer in recent years, as the Imperial Webway project deepened in scope. Horus's war councils often operated for months without a single word from him. "What does he say?" Horus asked. Russ hesitated. The hesitation was more revealing than any message. Russ was not a man who hesitated. "He commands you to return to Ulanor," Russ said quietly. "He wants to meet you, alone, no legion, no escort." Horus felt a chill coil around his spine. "Why now?" Russ exhaled slowly. Perhaps he heard what happened at Xenobia. Horus studied the warp outside. Or perhaps he knew before we ever arrived. They both fell silent. The Emperor had always moved with knowledge no mortal could match. No Primarch could claim to understand the full depth of his sight. If the Interex had learned of a prophecy concerning the War Master, then the Emperor surely had known long before they uttered the first warning. That truth cut deeper than any blade. Russ spoke again, voice lower. "Do you think he hid this from you?" Horus did not answer. Instead, he watched the warp swirl, each tide carrying 1,000 futures. Some futures flickered with cold blue light, others trembled with gold. A few glowed with a hungry red that pulsed like a heartbeat taken from the corpse of a god. When he spoke, his voice held no anger. "I think he shaped me without my consent, and I think the Interex saw the shape he intended." Russ stiffened. "Careful. I am being careful," Horus said. For the first time, before Russ could respond, the alarm klaxons pulsed. Warp turbulence rocked the ship. Officers rushed to consoles, chanting Binharic commands to stabilize the Geller field. The warp around them churned with agitation, surges of hostile resonance striking the shields like waves against a cliff. This was not normal turbulence. It felt targeted. "It is reacting to something," Russ growled. "What did we bring with us?" Horus felt the crystalline Interex fragment warm in his pocket. He had forgotten it was there. The shard pulsed in synchrony with the warp storm outside. The resonance between them thrummed like two instruments responding to the same conductor. The warp storm intensified. Loken entered the strategium at a run. "My lord, the Mechanicum has traced the resonance spike. It originates from that fragment. They say it is interacting with the warp in ways they cannot predict." Erebus appeared behind him, almost as if summoned by fate. He bowed in false humility. "My War Master, the shard carries harmonics your mind responded to during analysis. It awakens because you awakened it," Russ snarled, stepping between Erebus and Horus. "You speak like a sorcerer." Erebus smiled faintly, only as a servant of truth. Horus ignored them. He withdrew the shard. It pulsed violently, brighter than before, its light bending in ways that made the eyes ache. The warp outside responded with renewed rage, the currents tightening around the ship in spirals that resembled grasping hands. Loken moved toward Horus. "Sir, we must destroy it." Horus held the shard tightly. For a moment, he thought he saw something inside the crystal. Not a shape, not a figure, a pattern, a ripple. A reminder of the shadow from the Interex archive. He closed his hand around it. "No." Loken froze. Russ stared at him with dawning alarm. "Brother, you have to let it go." Horus shook his head. "This is knowledge the Emperor did not give us. Knowledge the Interex believed we must not have. I cannot destroy what may be the truth." The warp storm slammed into the Geller field with enough force to send shockwaves through the decks. Sparks burst from consoles. Crew shouted prayers. The ship groaned as if something vast pressed against its hull. Erebus watched with quiet fascination, eyes reflecting the shard's light. "My War Master," he said softly. "The shard calls to the future that the Interex feared." Horus turned sharply. "And what future is that?" Erebus's voice became almost gentle. "The future in which you stop obeying the Emperor." Russ lunged at him, but Erebus stepped back with serpent reflexes. Loken drew near, placing himself between the chaplain and the War Master. Horus raised a hand. No one moved. "The warp reacts to possibility," Erebus said. "This shard shows you a possibility the Emperor cannot deny and the Interex sought to bury." Horus felt the shard thrum like a heartbeat in his palm. The warp storm roared. The ship trembled. Inside the shard, the shadow rippled again, like a sleeper turning in restless dreams. And for a moment, Horus felt something impossible. He felt recognition. He dropped the shard. It hit the deck with a sound like shattering glass, yet it did not break. Its light dimmed. The warp currents eased, the storm dissipating with reluctant retreat. The Geller field stabilized. The crew exhaled as if waking from a nightmare. Russ stared at Horus with a look devoid of rank or role. It was the expression of a brother afraid for another. "What did you feel?" Russ asked quietly. Horus did not answer. He looked at the shard on the floor, its glow fading, but its presence unchanged. Then he looked at his own reflection in the viewport. The warp's colors shifted behind him. None of the colors felt benign. He whispered a truth he had not meant to speak aloud. "It recognized me." Russ flinched. Erebus smiled. Loken stared at the War Master with a dread that settled like frost, and the vengeful spirit continued toward Davin, carrying a man who no longer trusted the shape of his own destiny. The Emperor's name carried no power in the chamber where Horus stood now, surrounded not by warriors or counselors, but by the weight of a civilization he did not know how to unmake. The Interex envoy had brought him deeper into the Hall of Echoes, past the vaulted galleries of living light, and into a sanctum where the air felt dense with memory. Every surface held inscriptions etched not by tools, but by minds disciplined enough to shape matter through intent alone. Even the War Master hesitated before crossing its threshold, as if the place itself judged his presence. The envoy spoke again, softer this time, their voice losing the steel they had shown aboard the vengeful spirit. They seemed almost tired. Your brother did not understand what he found here. A pause, deliberate. We pray you do. Horus stepped forward, boots echoing against a floor that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat older than Terra's gene line. He could feel Russ's warning lodged like a thorn behind his ribs. This was no simple diplomatic display. This was revelation, offered with hands trembling between hope and fear. At the chamber's center stood an object that seemed carved from the absence of light itself, a sphere so black it swallowed reflections, warped space, blurred the edges of its own existence. Horus had seen relics from the dark age of technology locked in vaults beneath the Imperial palace. He had watched tech priests fall to their knees before fragments of circuitry. But this was different. This was not technology. This was intent crystallized into matter, the essence of an idea too vast to belong in mortal hands. A dozen Interex custodians knelt around it, their eyes closed, each holding a harp-like instrument wired directly into their minds. Their breathing matched the whispering hum resonating through the chamber. Horus felt the vibration in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. It was not sound, it was understanding, trying to shape itself into language. The envoy lifted a hand, and the harmonic resonance ceased. The custodians opened their eyes, exhaustion etched into the fine lines of their faces. This, the envoy said, voice steady again, is what remains of the Kinobranch's last communion with humanity. A warning gifted before the last fall. A memory of what sleeps beneath the warp's surface. Horus approached the sphere, every instinct screaming for caution. It seemed less an object and more an aperture, a place where the skin between realities thinned. When he reached out with a thought, not a touch, not even an intention, just a flicker of curiosity, the surface responded, not with light or sound, but with a sensation like a shadow turning toward him. In that instant he saw something, not clearly, not even coherently, but enough to make him recoil. A shape without shape, a hunger without need, a logic so cold it made chaos seem emotional. He staggered, breath catching. The custodians lowered their gaze, as though his reaction pained them. You feel it, the envoy murmured. The thing your empire refuses to name. The thing that drove your kind to wipe our shared memory from history once before. Horus forced his posture steady. Your poetry obscures more than it reveals. Our warnings are never poetic, the envoy whispered, only misunderstood. Silence settled again, thick and alive. Horus felt the eyes of the custodians weighing him, measuring not his rank or authority, but the shape of his soul. For the first time since the triumph at Ulanor, he felt small. The envoy gestured toward the sphere's abyssal surface. This truth is why we feared your brother, why we fear your emperor. Because you seek to master a galaxy shaped by forces that cannot be commanded, only survived, and because you march toward a destiny they will not allow. Horus did not answer immediately. He listened to the quiet hum beneath the chamber's stillness, a rhythm like the universe breathing. Show me, he finally said. The envoy did not look relieved. If anything, their expression darkened. We already are. The months after the ceasefire did not unfold like an aftermath. They unfolded like sediment settling over a body that had never been retrieved. Xenobia did not rebuild. It reorganized. Not through decrees or victories or proclamations, but through the slow, quiet accumulation of choices made by people who no longer remembered what the world had looked like before the Interex rewrote its pulse. By the time the dust finally stopped drifting in the streets, there was no war left to speak of, only the consequences, vast and patient, waiting for someone to acknowledge them. Horus stood on a balcony of alien alloy overlooking the Mosaic Quarter, the district that had become the most visible fusion of everything the Interex had imposed and everything humanity had surrendered. Below him, the city moved with a rhythm that felt unnatural in its calm. Power lines mapped themselves across rooftops in precise geometric patterns. Interex signal towers pulsed with that soft, unbroken luminescence he had come to dread. And in the streets, voices rose in languages that once would have been considered heresy simply for existing. He watched a group of children chase a floating drone down a narrow avenue, their laughter bending effortlessly between low Gothic and the Interex harmonic, as if both had always belonged to them. He could not decide which language unsettled him more. It was not the novelty of the foreign tongue. It was the ease, the forgetting. The way these children carried themselves with the poise of people who had already inherited a future their ancestors had died refusing. A slow ache worked its way behind his sternum. The memory of the sphere in the Hall of Echoes lingered like a wound that had never been stitched properly. He knew now why the Interex walked with fear buried so deep beneath their civility. They had not mastered the thing that slept beneath the warped surface. They had simply learned to coexist with its shadow. Humanity would learn the same, whether it wanted to or not. Footsteps approached behind him. Varel stepped into view, shoulders heavy, eyes lined with exhaustion that felt older than the war itself. He had led the last oath through sabotage, counter-sabotage, and the bitter arithmetic of resistance that devoured far more than it saved. Now he looked less like a commander and more like a man carrying a weight that refused to be shared. "It's done," Varel said quietly. "The locals approved the new allotment rights. They call it efficiency." Horus did not respond. He simply watched the crowds below, where Interex constructs cast long shadows across markets that had once belonged solely to humanity. They distributed goods with speed and precision, and the people accepted it because the alternative was hunger. New orders. Always won when old hopes were tired. "You sound defeated," Horus said. "I sound honest," Varel replied, a humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth before dying again. "The old ways are fading, faster than any of us thought possible." A procession passed beneath them, 3 humans and 1 Interex escort. The humans carried bioluminescent grafts along their temples, glowing faintly with each measured breath. They deferred to the Xeno-operative with a familiarity that made Horus's throat tighten. That deference had once belonged to him, to the Imperium, to Terra. Now it belonged to a logic of survival he could neither command nor deny. "The Council wants you at the memorial tonight," Varel said. "They're unveiling a monument. Reconciliation, they're calling it." The word felt heavy. He did not ask reconciliation with whom. He already knew the answer, and the question terrified him. A distant siren rose, not a warning, but a soft melodic chime, marking the start of a harvest shift. The Interex had replaced industrial klaxons with tones calibrated to lower human stress responses. It made obedience feel natural, automatic, painless. Horus closed his eyes long enough to steady himself. The Interex had brought order, predictability, survival. The Imperium had brought zeal, unity, fire. Between the two, Xenobia had chosen the one that let its children live. History would judge the choice later, or not at all. Varel stepped back toward the stairwell. "Tell me something," he murmured. "Did we lose, or did we win and hate what the victory turned us into?" Horus opened his eyes. A breeze moved through the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of Interex flora blooming across the meditation fields. Sweet and sharp, familiar and alien. It was the smell of a future already rooted too deeply to excise. He answered without turning. "Some victories aren't victories at all. They're defeats that learned patience." Varel said nothing, perhaps because there was nothing left to argue. After he left, Horus stood alone on the balcony, watching the world reshape itself without asking permission. He watched workers enter manufactorums built with Interex angles instead of Imperial arches. He watched grafted citizens move with a serenity he could not trust. He watched a city breathe in a pattern no longer designed by human fear, but by alien pragmatism. He thought of Terra. He thought of the Emperor's dream. He thought of the future he had once believed was inevitable. Xenobia lived. Humanity endured. But the Imperium, the idea of it, the unity of it, the dream of it, guttered like a dying lumen, and went out quietly, without ceremony or mourning, not because the Interex killed it, because the people they saved no longer needed it. A child below looked up again, the same girl as before. Her graft flickered gently as it read subtle cues in his stance, his heartbeat, the way his silhouette disrupted the light. She did not salute him. She only watched him with a curiosity free of reverence, free of fear, free of anything that recognized the war master of the Imperium at all. Not hatred, not loyalty, just newness. And that was the cruelty of it. Horus exhaled, long and slow. The galaxy did not break with fire. It broke with understanding, human enough to survive. Not human enough to comfort him. The winds shifted again. The city moved on. The Interex towers pulsed. The drone dropped another line of shimmering mist over the fields. And somewhere far beneath the warp's skin, the thing the Interex feared turned in its sleep, uninterested in the arguments of mortals. In the grim darkness of the far future, survival was never triumph. It was only the slowest, quietest defeat. And Xenobia had just learned how to live with it.